We'll now have comments from Lloyd Strickland.
Thank you. Right, rather than just launch in with some comments, I'd just like to give a little context to them. I'm afraid that's going to involve, to some extent, summarising various aspects of what Mike has just said. So, if we quickly remind ourselves of the problem that underpins Leibniz's discussions of moral necessity. And the problem, of course, is the spectre of necessitarianism. And that's haunted optimists, past and present. Optimists generally agree that God's omniscience leads him to know what is most perfect, his omnipotence enables him to bring that about, and his perfect goodness ensures that he wouldn't even countenance acting in a less than perfect way. And from this, it seems to follow that the operation of the most perfect being is always most perfect. And that's, of course, a view that Leibniz holds. And in fact, there's one text where Leibniz puts it almost exactly like that in those terms. And it seems to many to follow that if God's operation is always most perfect, if he always does what is most perfect, then he necessarily creates the best possible world. And it's at this point that the optimist finds himself embroiled in what Mike has called the theological necessity argument, which he outlines in the following way. First premise, necessarily, God wills the best. Second premise, necessarily, there's one world which is the best, namely our world. Conclusion, necessarily, our world exists. Now, as Mike pointed out, Leibniz developed responses to both of the premises of this argument. But in my remarks, I'm just going to focus on the first premise and Leibniz's response to that. The one that says, necessarily, God wills the best. And for much of his career, it seems that Leibniz rejects this premise on the grounds that there cannot have been any necessity in God's choice of the best because other, lesser worlds are possible, in the sense that they're internally coherent, they're free from contradiction. So Leibniz's thinking here proceeds something like this. He says, if God wills the best out of necessity, then the best possible world is necessary. If the best possible world is necessary, then it's the only possible world. But the best possible world is not the only possible world, because worlds other than the best are possible, in the sense that they're non-contradictory. Therefore, God doesn't will the best out of necessity. And of course, Leibniz doesn't usually stop there. Very often, he's going to go on to draw out further consequences, one of which is that God wills freely. Another consequence is that the universe is contingent. But anyway, that, in essence, is what Mike has called the possible in its own nature response to the problem of theological necessitarianism. And to the best of my knowledge, Leibniz starts to use that around the 1680s. And then he continues to do so for the rest of his life. And it's got very good grounds on that basis to be considered Leibniz's stock response to the theological necessity argument. But late in his career, Leibniz also offers what looks to be, and what according to Mike is, a different response to the necessitarian challenge. In this response, we find Leibniz accepting that God does indeed will the best of necessity, but that this is the moral kind of necessity rather than the dreaded metaphysical kind. I think it's worth being clear about how Leibniz characterizes these two kinds of necessity. First, then, we have metaphysical necessity. He sometimes calls this absolute or logical or mathematical necessity. This applies to that which cannot fail to happen or fail to be the case, in the very strongest sense of cannot. In other words, something is metaphysically necessary if its opposite or contrary implies a contradiction. On the other hand, we have moral necessity, and that refers to the inevitable occurrence of those courses of actions which free beings judge to be the best. So in other words, moral necessity refers to the way a free being's will is determined, namely by its being bound to choose the course of action that seems best or most fitting to that being's intellect. Now, of these two, Leibniz discusses and he treats the first of these kinds of necessity throughout his career, the early part, the middle part, and late on. But that is not the case with the second kind, which only starts to appear in Leibniz's work quite late. I think it's from around 1707. And unfortunately, when he does start to use it, he just doesn't go into much detail about it. And at the end of his paper, Mike claimed that in Leibniz's day, I'll quote, "Talk about moral necessity was so pervasive that Leibniz would not have felt it necessary to acknowledge debts to the thinkers in whose footsteps he chose to follow." That strikes me as plausible, not least because we can see some of Leibniz's contemporaries doing exactly the same thing. And Anthony Collins would be an example of another early modern philosopher who made use of the notion of moral necessity in his work and in the context of human free choices. But when he does so, when he makes use of this notion, he doesn't think it necessary to acknowledge his debts. So as I say, Collins mentions moral necessity in connection with human actions, and he writes as follows, and I quote, "When I affirm necessity, I contend only for what is called moral necessity, meaning thereby that man, who is an intelligent and sensible being, is determined by his reason and his senses. And I deny man to be subject to such necessity as is in clocks, watches, and such other beings, which, for want of sensation and intelligence, are subject to an absolute physical or mechanical necessity. And here also I have the concurrence of almost all the greatest asserters of liberty, who either expressly maintain moral necessity or the thing signified by those words." So that's Anthony Collins using the notion of moral necessity. But except in that passage, Collins doesn't use the expression moral necessity again. But the fact that he didn't need to flesh it out indicates, I think, just how confident he was that his readers would be familiar with the notion. So I take it then that Mike has a very strong case for treating Leibniz as part of the moral necessitarian tradition, and also for thinking that Leibniz not only appropriated the notion of moral necessity from his philosophical forebears, but that he considered it to be sufficiently well known that he felt no need to introduce it or subject it to a lengthy or detailed treatment in his work. Now, an obvious question to ask at this point is this: why did Leibniz decide to align himself with the moral necessitarians when he did? And the question's all the more interesting since all the parts of the moral necessity doctrine, at least as Leibniz understands it, they all seem to be present and correct in his writings long before he employs the notion itself. And it's certainly the case that the youthful Leibniz, the earlier Leibniz, fully accepted the key tenet of moral necessitarianism, which is the view that the will is attracted towards the perceived best course and is bound to choose it. And the youthful Leibniz also accepted that this applied in God's case as much as it did to any other being endowed with a will. So, to all intents and purposes, on the matter of God's choice of the best, it seems as though Leibniz was a moral necessitarian many years before he identified himself as one in his writings. I'm sorry if that looks a little bit imposing and a little bit small to read as well, but what I want to do is just illustrate the point here. On the left-hand side, I've got what I take to be the core features of the doctrine of moral necessity as Leibniz applies it in the Theodicy in the context of God and theological necessitation. So there are three key parts, I think, to this doctrine of moral necessity. The first says, God's will is determined to choose the best, because his will, like all wills, is naturally attracted towards and is bound to choose the perceived best course. And his supreme intellect ensures that in his case, the perceived best and the actual best are one and the same thing. Consequently, the determination to the best stems from God's own perfect nature rather than from anything external to him. That's the first core claim. Second claim says, God is not metaphysically necessitated to choose the best.